I want to introduce Kelley Crawford. Her work that she'll be presenting on today is on women, arms and agency, the relationship between women and security in Port of Spain. This is definitely an issue that I think all of us are interested in, various reasons, out of research or activism, or simply in relation to our living in the space. So I think we look forward to what it is you have to say.
Thank you.
Welcome her.
And the study came about not out of gender, but as an issue of security and community, and looking at community cohesion, we decided to look at women as a community. And Port of Spain, in the last 10 years, 15 years, has become a prominent place to discuss security as different problems have been emerging and different tactics have been used. In general, there's been a lot of focus on women in the last 10 to 12 to 15 years, including them in peace processes and security-making processes. The first was the UN Security Council resolution in 2000. That was the first security resolution that included a topic related specifically to gender and the effects of war and conflict on women. 10 years later, Prime Minister Bissessar actually introduced the General Assembly Resolution 6569, which dealt with women, disarmament, and how to include women in peace process making. The Small Arms Treaty Agreement that was, I don't think passed, but worked on this summer in July in New York, included topics related to women and how to actually involve them in the process of security measures, and then plans of action from the UN and the United States have been implemented and discussed in the last year. Most recently in August, the United States passed the Plan of Action on Women, Peace, and Security, which discussed measures of how to actually include women in not only policy making and decision making and security building, but grassroots efforts that include women at all levels. And with this in mind, the disarmament is about not only reducing the number of weapons at hand, but also breaking down the mentality of a region or people that rely on weapons to sustain a way of life. That's the idea that there's a mentality that includes women. People like to talk about that men are the primary victims and perpetrators of violence and gun violence, but that women play a role regardless of whether they are directly involved or indirectly involved. And so we want to acknowledge that. So then the umbrella question that the resolutions and the plans of actions bring to question are, how can we include women? They say that it's important to include women and that we should include women, but they don't say how it's possible, they don't say how we can, or how women would want to. And so what we decided to research was, what are women's perspectives? What are the ways that women feel about guns, feel about violence? Because you can't necessarily assume that women are the less violent sex and that they will automatically oppose gun ownership, possession, or violence as use of intimidation for means of survival. So not us making assumptions. What are women's perspectives on guns and violence? And if we know their perspectives on guns and violence, we can know in what ways we could further include them, what ways they'd be willing and amenable to being included. Further, if we ask them about their relationship with different channels that are already existing towards security measures, if we talk about police, government programs, community programs that deal with security, which ones they are favorable towards and which ones they are untrusting of, then you know in what ways you can move forward, including them in greater numbers. Not just in policy making and decision making, but in actually securing, initiating peace at the community level. So with that in mind, the research question became, how the increases in Port of Spain in the last decade and illegal small arms possession and armed violence during the last decade affected the perspectives of women from violent areas regarding personal security and agency, and how do they negotiate security? So how do they negotiate security, not only their personal security, but security within their homes, for their families, and on a broader level within their communities? The sub-questions, how do women define personal security? And you find that there's a broad definition actually of not only what is personal security, but the priorities of personal security. Which forms of armed violence they experienced, which forms they fear, how do these fears affect their agency, how do women negotiate security through formal and informal channels. So formal channels, meaning government, police, what is available to them, they can make use of to put to use to assist their agency. And informal, everything from family and friends to community organizations that they initiate themselves. And what potential do women feel that they have? What's their perception of being able to negotiate security in their homes and communities? So these are the three main topics: armed violence, personal security, and agency in the conceptual framework. This is specific to Port of Spain as of research that small arms, we were just discussing, there are different definitions, different perspectives on how the problem with small arms came to be. A general consensus is that drug trafficking initiated small arms and light weapons trafficking, which increased the number of civilians who illegally possess small arms, which leads to violence, which affects personal security and agency. But if agency can be increased through the increase of personal security, peace can be negotiated and there can be a greater sense of improved personal security for everyone, for community security. The three main topics, I'll go ahead and define a little bit from the theoretical framework. Armed violence, as defined by small arms and light weapons. Small arms and light weapons is the category that handguns falls into in terms of weapons. Light weapons generally refers to ammunitions and even small armored military vehicles like tanks. So that's not necessarily a problem here in Trinidad because there's not a militia issue, it's personal issues. So that's small arms, which is handguns, guns or weapons that are portable, concealable, and as a matter of fact, hard to track, mark, or trace. Personal security. Personal security is a broad theoretical concept that includes everything from income security to health security, but for the purpose of this study, we've diminished that to the absence of threat to personal safety, violence, intimidation based on personal physical harm, and the fear of victimization as well. So personal security includes the psychological and the physical aspect. And then agency refers to a person's ability to enact change on their own behalf. And in this sense, we consider the psychological and the physical ability to do so congruent as well. Not only that a person has the assets available to them and the ability to make change, but that they perceive themselves as having that as well. So, in other words, a person's resources are only as valuable as the person perceives them to be. So in this case, a police force may only be as valuable as a person believes calling the police to report a crime would be valuable to them. In terms of gender, female agency is based on the idea that sometimes women are considered victims or bystanders in terms of conflict areas, and that it's more productive to include them as actors and look at what their roles are, whether indirectly or directly engage women as actors in the problem. And differentiate, in this aspect, you differentiate between vulnerability and powerlessness. Women are a vulnerable group, but by assessing their agency, you give them power as well. You look at the power that they do have and look at the power that they don't have and where the gaps are, and move from vulnerability to move to look at them as a vulnerable group rather than a powerless, detached, unengaged group. The unit of analysis is mostly east Port of Spain, or all east Port of Spain, concentrated in Laventille areas, sort of the beginning of the Belmont, Laventille border, all the way down through Beetham. And we chose that in part because all of Port of Spain was too much of an undertaking for a 10-week research period, and one person, myself. Although, and I should mention, I'm doing this research in accordance with WINAD, Women's Institute of Alternative Development, based out of Belmont, and this will be a part of a bigger ongoing project that they're doing. They've helped me secure access to these areas, and the limitations to access include the fact that, as I've found out, even locals aren't necessarily allowed, or it's not advised that they go into all of these areas. And so as an outsider and someone who's unfamiliar with the area, unfamiliar with the residents of those areas, it would seem suspicious if I were there asking questions. Not only that, but the security of the women would be at stake. There's a problem with there's a fear of being labeled an informer, and so women can't necessarily speak freely. For that reason, random sampling is out of the question, even for the case of a sample questionnaire. And so we used multiple vantage points to try to at least broaden the scope. It won't be a representative sample, but we thought at least we could get varying opinions. So we started with WINAT and their contacts that include people at the CSP, different agents from different areas. So St. Barb's and Beetham have been the two areas that I've been in the most. And we use those opportunities to go to community meetings and see how the meetings are functioning, both men and women engaged, and what the women's perspectives are in the capacity of being part of a government program, and then also use their outreach to get women to come to a secure location in their own neighborhood and talk. Another vantage point has been support groups for victims of violence or those who've experienced loss due to violence. This is a lot of women from the Laventille, Belmont area who've experienced loss and have been a part of support groups, and in some cases have gone on to start their own initiatives. And then lastly, people who know people, snowball interviewing through trying to get at least a few perspectives of random sample. And with interviewing, we always try to measure the tools of agency with our questions, whether from personal perspective or in terms of community perspective. Trust, a person's trust for their neighbors, for their community, the trust that they have in their own family and in the people around them, the level of trust that women have in terms of how they can use that for support. If they were to need it, the community cohesion, how much a community trusts or distrusts in general each other, local affiliations, church groups, anything that could provide support if a woman were in an unsafe situation, if she felt that her situation was insecure, where she could go for assistance. So local churches and neighborhoods or organizations such as nonprofits or women's organizations that work within areas, and schools, homework centers, anything that provide assistance to women that creates independence for women and therefore agency. And then government agencies who have programs such as the CSP, the Citizen Security Program, which is a pilot program that's gone for, I think it's in its 5th year now and has about one more left. In 22 high violence, high crime areas to test out if implementing programs that create community cohesion and give space for positive progress, if that advances the well-being of residents and diminishes the amount of violence in general. Reliability of the police force. So in that sense, the trust that women have in the police and how much they utilize. Glad you all could join us. We're just explaining a little bit the basic setup of the research before I talk about some of the interviews and discussion groups that I've had with women. It deals with women, security, and agency. So how women combat insecurity on a personal basis and what women can do collectively to combat insecurity on a community level. So reliability of the police force, in other words, how much faith women have that the police force is able to assist them if they have a problem, the trust that they have that the police can keep them safe if they report a problem, and the faith that they have that the police force can bring a perpetrator to justice if need be. And on the personal level, the household dynamic regarding knowledge and opinions, the prerogative that a woman feels she has within her own home to have an opinion, to state that opinion, and that that opinion would be listened to, is a form of agency in terms of raising your children, in terms of what's going on inside your house, in terms of if a partner, boyfriend, or husband is engaged in activity that she feels is dangerous for herself or her children, that she has the right to stop it or influence it. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the interactions that I've had with women. It's sort of the most interesting part of what's been going on now. It's an in-progress field work I'd like you to keep in mind. So the perspectives are sort of general and can't be necessarily concluded for this study. But the ways that women define personal security, they almost always think externally, external from the home. If they begin to talk about security, they talk about fear of strangers, fear of walking around certain places or certain times of night, and the limitations that it puts on their ability to act freely. They never necessarily have mentioned the way that guns affect the dynamic within the home. We were interested in how guns affect the power dynamic between men and women. Even if there's always a physical disparity between the strength of men and women, and therefore the ability for a relationship to be dominated, how the presence of a gun maybe exacerbates that. And in my experience, women have not said that guns have been used as a method of intimidation or that they've been used against them physically. So there's been discussion of abuse, but mostly physical abuse that doesn't include armed violence or intimidation of a weapon. In that mentioning of domestic violence, it's brought up time and time again, but women don't necessarily say that they've experienced it from a first-hand perspective, but that it is rampant. And not just to me, but in people that I've talked to who work with the CSP or other organizations, women are sometimes hesitant to come forward about their own experiences with domestic violence. There are a couple of reasons that that could be. In some senses, people seem to think that it could have become normalized, that abuse is so widespread that women don't necessarily associate it as an insecurity, it's just a way of life. They might not necessarily realize or view it as a problem that needs correcting, but then if they do, the alternative, they could recognize it as a problem that needs correcting, but they don't necessarily believe that there's a safer alternative to the existence that they already have that's progressed to a certain level, that they don't know that they can counteract that. They don't know that necessarily going to the police would do anything but exacerbate the situation, because sometimes nothing happens, the police correct, and then there is retribution from men that have been reported. In terms of personal security as well, we do deal with the individual, but when you talk about personal security, so many women bring up their children almost immediately that I think it's fair to almost consider it an indirect aspect of personal security, the security that women feel they have for their children. Okay, I'll get to that in the next part. And then I'll move on to which forms of armed violence have they experienced. They're quick to open up about violence that they've witnessed and the loss that they've experienced due to armed violence, but less about the experiences that they've experienced themselves in terms of armed violence, like I mentioned, or intimidation. But the issue of children, they fear the loss of children or husbands due to armed violence or gang affiliation. And in that is the fear that children can be corrupted by what's going on in the community, either that sons will be influenced to join a gang or the retribution of gangs if sons are not amenable to joining. And then with daughters, they worry about a different kind of corruption, that they could get involved with the bad boys, so to speak, of the neighborhood. And there's a different kind of pressure on women, I've found, to provide their daughters with the material things that they require or want, because if they don't, they might seek it from a man who has the means to give them that, but his income is not necessarily from, or it could be from illicit activity. And so women have a fear that if they can't provide monetarily for their daughters, that they'll lose their daughters to an unsafe situation because the daughter is trying to seek financial security. They fear being in the wrong place at the wrong time and being an accidental victim of violence. And with this fear, they fear being labeled an informant, which leads to a range of inactivity. If an informant is targeted, then they could either have to move out of their neighborhood, be threatened to move out of their neighborhood, or could be killed. And so with this, women are hesitant to report crimes that they witness, or report crimes that they know that are going on in their house. That's related as well to the fear of losing their sons and husbands, because if, for instance, if a woman found a gun in her home and she didn't want it there, she can't necessarily just take it to the police because she's liable for the fact that it was there as well. And if her son or husband is arrested, she's liable to be arrested herself, which time and again people say that's the main reason they don't want guns in their home, because if a police raid occurs and a gun is found, everyone is equally responsible. But then even if a son or husband or partner is found with a gun, even if the woman doesn't want them to have guns, even if they would prefer it be taken away, they can't necessarily risk the financial insecurity of the breadwinner being locked away for a certain amount of time. And then another effect of this is we expected there to be an effect of stress. You know, if you can't walk freely, if you can't be in certain neighborhoods, you have to worry about your security. There's a stress added to your daily existence that decreases quality of life. But another thing we found is that a burden that women mention having to live with on a daily basis is the grief. And not only the grief that they would be dealing with in general, trying to deal with loss, but because loss is so widespread, it happens again and again, that every time you hear of another mother who's lost a son or another incident that is relatable to what you experience, that you relive it. And so it makes it very hard to move on. It makes it very hard to escape. And then within the community, there's so much retaliation that it makes it hard to move on with your neighbors, because maybe her son was involved in what got someone in your family killed. And so there's suspicion among neighbors and an inability to work together to move forward. For instance, support groups are generally not in the community, although that could seem like it's something that would be beneficial, but it could be something that created grudges, because anything you say, you have to worry that it's going to tip somebody off, that maybe someone in your family was the reason that someone in their family was murdered. And then lastly, the stigmatization affects their agency, they feel, because after a community becomes known for high violence, high crime, it's not as respected. The people from there are sort of labeled as being from a stigmatized area, and it can affect the way that you perceive yourself, and therefore your own ability to break out of that label, of having a diminished capacity. And then people say that when you're trying to get a job, sometimes that people don't want to hire someone from these disreputable neighborhoods because they're just in general thought of as lesser community residents. So how do women negotiate security through formal and informal channels? Informally, the first thing that's always mentioned is prayer. Women actually rely on prayer as a method to combat the instability in their lives. I've had women tell me that they've had it hit out on them, and the way that the first thing that they turned to was prayer in order to hope that it didn't happen or work against it happening, I guess. And with that is reliance on church groups. That's generally the first set of people that a woman trusts. I found that they have the greatest trust and the greatest community cohesion among each other at religious functions or affiliations. And then beyond that, family. Most families consider each other trustworthy and close, and then 1 to 2 family members. Although in general, people say that they don't trust their communities, they don't trust their neighbors, even though people have lived in their neighborhood for their whole lives. And that's true of a lot of people, so they maybe necessarily have grown up with their neighbors. Because the situation is so unstable, they don't trust people that even they've known for their life. So they might have one or two neighbors that they feel like they trust, and by that we mean that they could go to if they felt unsafe and needed assistance, and one or two people that they feel like would come to them if those people felt like they were unsafe, that they would come and ask for help. And self-esteem and confidence play a big role in what women say is important, that it's a personal decision to take responsibility and to decide that you have the agency to reach out and move on. And with that comes sort of secondary, informal channel, which is this communal channel, which is the initiatives that women have started with each other and on their own to diminish the effects that the violence and the loss that took place in the last decade. Community events. Women initiate community events in the forms of everything from roadside meetings, where they set up weekly or monthly meetings just on the corner to talk about what's going on in the neighborhood and how they feel about it and what they can do to improve it, to broader events like children's recitals or plays that they get the children together for in order to get the parents to come, in order to create some community cohesion. And they mentioned that there are these certain bad boys, which are targets in the neighborhood that most people avoid or are afraid of, and they go out of their way to include them so that those people remember that they're a part of the community, feel included, don't feel excluded, and are maybe more likely to reach out for an alternative if they think that it would be possible to bring them in a positive manner. And then outreach to youth. Everything from setting up homework centers in the afternoons, which provides women who work with an appropriate manner to have their children watch so they don't have to worry they'll get into trouble, and also to help kids with school, to camps that have been set up outside of communities so that children have the opportunity to take advantage of different areas of Trinidad, different things that they might not get to travel to otherwise, in just an effort to give kids some fun, some positive reinforcement, and at the same time, the women that I've met go out of their way to talk to children about relationships, healthy ways to deal with bullying, healthy ways to deal with the stresses that their life might entail. So from early on, you try to build positive reinforcement to counter some of the stress and grief that they live with. When it comes to formal channels, people are often less optimistic than they are even about the small-scale community projects that they're a part of. For instance, the police. It's rare that I found someone that has a positive perception of the police. Sometimes women say there are good police officers and there are bad police officers, and the first step in if you have experienced a crime or an act of violence is to go to the police and hope that you find someone who can help you versus someone who is engaged in illicit activity, that it can come back to you. Most women say that there's been so much offense with the police and their communities that the police are, it's almost an us versus them mentality. And so if there's a crime or an act of violence, you don't reach out to the police, you handle it on your own. Because reaching out to the police can in fact cause more problems than it helps. Because they don't think the police generally don't have the capacity or aren't willing to or aren't interested in helping women with issues of, say, domestic violence. They'll take a report and that's absolutely it. And so if there's any repercussion for reporting a crime, then it's not worth it because there'll be no benefit anyway. Further, with the issue of, for instance, domestic violence, there aren't necessarily broad strategies set up to assist women get out of bad situations. For instance, the government has government safe houses, but those safe houses aren't set up for first-time offenses. So a woman can't absolutely call and say, I've been abused and I'm afraid, and be taken away to a safe house. It has to be registered complaints over a period of time so that it can be assessed as an egregious situation, and then a woman can be arranged to be in a safe house at a certain point and probably her children in another, which that in itself is one reason that women oftentimes don't want to make use of this process. But also, if you have to complain several times and make multiple reports, a situation escalates in intensity, and it's harder to break a cycle after it's gotten to that point. And there's really no place, there may be places that I'm unaware of, that religious organizations or women's organizations run. There's safe houses for women, but the ones that are run by the government are not available to someone who's had a first-time altercation with a man living in their home. So those women have nowhere to go. They have to wait before it becomes a pattern, before they have somewhere to go. But the CSP, the Citizen Security Program that I mentioned earlier, is also a government initiative. It's been more favorably received. It implements positive programs that people have asked for, that the community itself has asked for. The CSP's standard, their method of operation is that they don't impose what changes need to take effect in a neighborhood or community, but they wait until the residents themselves ask for them so that they know there's interest, so that they know that there's a place for this to flourish. And so because people are able to enact their own ideas, there's a more positive reception to it, and also because people are more interested in the events. Are fun often. They throw parades, they have parties, they have musicians come, and so for that reason it's not looked at as necessarily a security effort, although at heart it is supposed to be community building and therefore a security effort. But one thing that's also interesting, I think, about the CSP is that they do have some parenting classes that include issues related to violence, for instance, ways to reprimand your children that don't include physical reprimand. But there's never been a program on relationships between men and women or domestic violence, although everyone pretty much asserts that domestic violence is a problem in most of these areas. There's never been the outreach to try to combat it because the women haven't asked for it. And so that leads back to that first, how do you define personal security? The first question of what is the reason that women haven't asked for help when the opportunity is there? There's someone saying what issues need to be addressed, and that is not an issue that's been brought up. So that's pretty much the results of the preliminary findings of the research to this point. And then I had some things that I wanted to ask you guys about that I thought would be interesting discussion, because we're all engaged in gender and living in the Port of Spain region. So I thought, what are the perceptions of the obstacles that face women? A lot of times women will say that it's not necessarily worth going out on a limb to help a woman. For instance, there was a case of a woman there was a teenager who was pregnant and her boyfriend was beating her up on the side of the road. And no one intervened because that particular man that she was seeing was known to carry a gun. And so they said, why would they risk their lives, because it would be a security threat to them to get involved. Why would they do that? Because they knew that she would go back to him. And that's been a general thing that I've heard quite a few times, that you don't intervene because girls will make the same mistakes over and over. And so there's no point, because you're not going to break a cycle by intervening. It's basically their own irresponsibility that's going to lead to it happening again. And so in these areas where there is violence, where mothers are losing their sons, there's also a stigmatization against that the sons were involved in illicit activity. If you're killed by a gun, it means you were involved with guns, and therefore with gangs and illicit activity. So is there this idea that it's personal irresponsibility, or is there more empathy for the struggle within communities, that the obstacles that women face, the legitimacy of their problems? Or is it something that people think that these communities have their own issues that they can't deal with?
It's interesting that you asked that question, because during your presentation I was thinking about asking if you found any discussion on this idea of desensitization. that people are kind of mentioning due to the fact that every time you look at the papers, it's the same regions and the same type of crime, like almost every day. So people just, they look at the papers and they don't really think about it anymore. You know, there's this empathy that you're mentioning, it doesn't come forward as much anymore. And you make these assumptions. So was there any discourse amongst the women themselves about feeling desensitized to what's happening to them?
Well, I think in terms of, like I said, loss, women seem to have a great sense of empathy that every time someone goes through it, they say regardless of the causes that brought that person to maybe being murdered, maybe that person was involved in criminal activity, but a mother cries the same. They say, and so every time that they read about something like that or hear about something like that, and there was discussion, there's been tons of discussion in the groups of women about who's been killed that they know of, even recently, even though statistics say that there are fewer murders going on, and women do say they feel safer than they did, for instance, 5 years ago, there's still an ongoing pattern of loss that is a heavy burden, it seems like, on all of them, regardless of when the last loss they experienced was. But in general, I do think that there has been a desensitization in some ways to the weight of the threat that they live within. One woman said, we're not safe, but we're not scared either, because you can't go on with that level of being afraid forever. There was a woman who, her son-in-law was shot, a stray bullet came through their window and killed him in his bed, and so she slept in her bathtub for months, I think. And she said, you can't continue to live with that sort of pressure, and therefore you have to let it go. And so I think on the individual basis, there is desensitization for survival purposes. The media has a tendency to sensationalize, and you read that murders are everywhere. Do you become desensitized to the problems? There's, a list of the deadliest areas in Trinidad. Do you say that it's their problem? Do you become desensitized to the fact that that's just the way it is in Lawmanville? Or do you still feel like the sense that there's something that needs to be done, that there's something that we need to all be engaged in? Or is it sort of viewed as those communities' problems, for those of you that have lived here a while?